Welcome to the Bleav in USC podcast. It is bye week. No game this week after beating Utah State 48-0. Hell must be chilly because the Trojans had a shutout for the first time since 2011. That was the 50-0 game against UCLA. We're thrilled to be joined by Luca Evans of the Southern California News Group for what is thankfully becoming a weekly appearance. Always very insightful. Luca, good to have you on, man. How are you doing this week?
Pretty good. That's was out at the Coliseum till about 2:30 on Saturday night, Sunday morning, I guess it was. It's that 8 p.m. start really kicked all of our butts, but really interesting game, like you said, with the shutout and heck of a start for USC this season.
Yeah, and talking of the shutout, where I want to start is something that was noticeably different this week, and something that I was looking for, because it's often very hard to learn things right in a game like this, where you're a 30-plus point favorite and expected to win handily. But in past seasons, for the last 15 years, very regularly USC has struggled with, I think, attention and commitment to the moment in games like this. And what was very evident early in this game is that outside of a couple of drops from the receiving group, it felt like every other position group was entirely focused and present, which is not something we've been able to say. I'm curious what your perception of that was, because to me, it looked visibly different. I mean, you go back to the San Jose State game last year, right? And that looked like a distracted team, or a team that did not take preparation seriously for that week. And, you can blame coaching for that. You can blame culture for that. But ultimately, it's hard to pinpoint where that comes from. This, though, did feel noticeably different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that San Jose State game is a great example, because I was almost thinking coming into this that it could play out very similarly to how that week one matchup last year played out. You have team coming off just a bruising fight, in Vegas against LSU, heading into a bye week. You think maybe there's a chance for them to start a bit slow, but what really stood out to me was, first off, on the offensive side of the ball, Lincoln Riley's emphasis to just establish the ground game early, absolutely get a rhythm there for Woody Marks, for Quentin Joyner, kind of in a way, in the preparation of the offensive line too. It just looked like a completely different effort from what we saw in the ground game in week one. And then just on the defensive side of the ball, I mean, you had the return of Bryson Barnes, the pig farmer, to the Coliseum, and obviously two completely different offenses than what we saw in Utah last year. And this Utah State team, didn't have Sion Vaki running out of the backfield and catching wheel routes, but just the preparation, the clear kind of containment on him, the impetus to not let him move around in the pocket and escape was just completely different than what we saw against Utah last year. And I think just the third down and fourth down aggressiveness that we've seen from Dan Lynn so far in these first couple of games is just pretty incredible in terms of, dialing up safety blitzes and sending guys off the edge and not being afraid to really take swings in those situations. And I think just the kind of relentlessness, the aggressiveness we saw on both sides of the ball. I mean, that's Big Ten football right there. And, it's on a week where you saw so many, national powers kind of struggle or stumble against these mid-major opponents. I think it was a really encouraging sign for USC to come out with that level of focus.
Yeah, you mentioned that third and fourth down aggressiveness. And I think what's so interesting about it is it's the perfect confluence of aggressiveness and creativity, because it's one thing to be predictably aggressive in those situations. But so far through two games, D'Anton Lynn has really been quite creative in the way he's gone about doing that. One player who we talked about before the start of the season that I thought was going to kind of be a temperature maker on this defensive staff and dictating how good are they as coaches was Eric Gentry. And this week, I think, was a really great example, because he played very well against Michigan, but he dominated against Utah State and totally looked like a player that they understood how to use, which I thought was so fascinating. as you look at Eric Gentry and you look at the way that they deploy him, I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic because he's such a unique player that it does almost take a particularly intelligent and creative coaching staff to know how to put him in the position to succeed.
Yeah, and I think in week one against LSU, I think you saw him deployed almost a little bit more creatively, a little bit more versatility. Just in he was coming off the edge a lot, in addition to playing, inside backer and put in a lot of different positions. Obviously, played more of kind of that traditional inside linebacker role this week with Mason Cobb out and starting in place of him. But what stood out to me there, in addition to just how Dan Lin is using him schematically, is he just emotionally, the aggressiveness just looks like a completely different player than we saw at times last year. And he's one of those guys that you can tell if he's happy, if he feels, valued, involved, he's going to be a completely different player. And we see that just in his media availability. He's, he's a funny guy. He's, quippy and that sort of thing. But after every single play, you watch him and he's talking trash to someone on the Utah State, someone on the field or someone on the sideline. It's just the emotion that he's playing with. I think, he has a lot of trust in Matt Entz, and I think Matt Entz has a lot of trust in him. He's spoken about that a lot. I really don't think he felt nearly that same level of confidence or trust in the coaching staff last season. And in this year, the emphasis on him is really bringing it out. And for so many years, I wrote about this last week, but the conversation around Eric Gentry has been, he needs to put on weight. Can he put on weight? Because he's got this skinny 6'6" guy running around at linebacker. I don't think the weight was never really the problem, I think, as we're seeing this year, because he's, it's just a matter of him playing lean and fast and aggressive and, kind of just turned loose. And I think that's what this staff has done with him.
And with the weight question, right, I think that it was unfair to him in many ways because he's a fairly strong guy at his size. He's just really long. He kind of has that almost NBA basketball player body, which is easy to discount the strength coming from it because it's so, long. Not everyone's built the same way, right? We're not all proportional in the same way. And I think a lot of us, myself included to some extent, I think fell to that trap of expecting him to fall into a certain kind of category because of the position that he plays. But it's so interesting watching guys like him because there are a handful on this team on both sides of the ball. Offensively, the guy who I'm so incredibly interested in right now is Lake McCree because, he's been the leading receiver in consecutive weeks. They're truly and honestly targeting the tight end position. And my reaction watching him in the first quarter against Utah State was he looks a lot like Mark Andrews. And I think people have forgotten just how much Lincoln Riley used the tight end at times at Oklahoma.
Yes.
And that's such I think, an encouraging aspect of this offense's development for USC and USC's fans, right? Because where you lose a lot of creativity and play extension in Caleb Williams, you add some pieces in places that didn't exist last year or weren't developed appropriately for McCree. Right? He got hurt at one point. And, I'm curious, what does Lake McCree bring from like a cultural, player standpoint? Because clearly on the field, he's a threat that we probably should have spoken more about. But, similar to a Lincoln Riley team, playing defense until a USC team uses the tight end well, we kind of just assume that it's not going to happen. But what can you say about Lake McCree and kind of what you've been able to deduce just by being around the team?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic, and I think touches on so many areas. That the first thing I'll say from like a broad offensive standpoint is that, you talk to, again, coaches who have coached with Lincoln Riley over the years, and he has his system, he has his philosophy, but he's also very adaptable to the personnel that he has. And this year, like Lake McCree said after the game, this is the deepest tight end room he's been a part of at USC. He's obviously, just developed over the years as a pass catcher, and all of a sudden you see USC running these, two tight end sets. You see them being used as blockers, and you see Lake McCree being heavily involved as a pass catcher. And I think, like you said, it's really encouraging development for, USC's kind of offensive evolution. With Lake, I mean, he first off just, I think he's a guy who's earned a ton of respect, if you hadn't already. He tore his ACL before the Holiday Bowl, and after 6 months, he was back, in pads and getting back to football related activities. And 6 months is a heck of a recovery time for an ACL. And Miller Moss, said that spoke a lot to who he is, just a tough kid. And I think the interesting thing with him and how he's being utilized, he and Miller both kind of pointed to it, that Miller Moss uses the tight end position or looks to it a little bit more as a quarterback than maybe Caleb Williams did. And so I think that's kind of a natural evolution and progression. He clearly has, a strong connection with Lake McCree. You see him looking for him a lot, on just kind of up the seam and those types of routes. And so I think that's a pretty positive development for, the progression of this offense.
So I'm going to pose a question to you here that's
Okay.
based off some observation. And, we'll preface this by saying through 2 games, the offense has been explosive to a point, right? There have been chunk plays, but we're still, there haven't been any 70-yard touchdowns. There's none of that. The defenses that they've played have done a pretty good job of forcing them into being a sustained offense. And I think that's going to be the game plan against Lincoln Riley pretty regularly, and until someone figures something out, which hasn't really happened. But when I look at this offense, my first thought is, because of the diversity of weapons and what that looks like. I'm not talking about position specifically, right? Like, we're not saying USC's better at the running back position than they were a year ago. That might not be true. But Woody Marks is certainly a more versatile threat than we had at that position last year, right? As a pass catcher, you see him not just catching swing passes, but a capable downfield receiver. You look at the tight end position being utilized, and the depth at receiver, while very young, and the talent there is starting to really show. Do you think that this is the most difficult Lincoln Riley USC offense to defend, even with Caleb Williams out of the question? Because he brings, a series of skills that by themselves make the offense extraordinarily difficult to defend, right? Because you have to be in pass coverage for 15 seconds, and pursuing a mobile quarterback with the kind of elusiveness that he has is a huge problem. But I'm tending to think right now that this may end up being the most difficult, at least to game plan against, because the diversity of both positional threats and the types of threats at those position groups is totally unlike either of the first 2 years under Lincoln Riley.
I would both, I think, agree and disagree with you on certain points. I think from a defensive standpoint, from a game planning perspective, game planning against Caleb Williams is a very, kind of impossible task for a college defense, because you do not know what is going to happen when a play breaks down, and there's only so much preparation that you can put towards that. But I think at the same time, there were so many more holes on, I think the offensive line was a lot better in 2022, but, last year you could, as a defense, game plan for that. This year, from what we've seen in the first 2 weeks, this offensive line has held up pretty well. And I think we'll see a true test of that against Michigan in a couple of weeks. That's going to be kind of that big emphasis, but that's, that's a much kind of stouter front. You have more diversity in the running back room, like you said, just a ton of weapons at receiver. You have the tight end position utilized a little bit more. And I think, I think the floor for this offense is kind of raised considerably from what it was last year. The execution at times still need a little bit better red zone execution than what we saw, and obviously a couple of drops in that last game. But there's a certain floor to how Miller Moss is going to run, Lincoln Riley's offense, and it's interesting when you hear him talk about it. It's almost like he's an extension of Lincoln Riley in a lot of respects, and I think at that level, that's what you'll see. And against Utah State as well, this is the other thing. They really did not get creative at all offensively. There was I think a second quarter flea flicker attempt, or if I'm remembering correctly, but outside of that, they ran the ball. They hit a lot of play action, and then they, just screamed Utah State to death in the second and third quarters. And there's going to be a lot more opportunity for them to open up that game plan. But I think with Miller Moss running the offense, I think with the amount of weapons here, I do think there is a higher floor than what we've seen, at USC for these first 2 years.
You mentioned the red zone execution. I think that's kind of an interesting one to zoom in on for a sec, because it was satisfactory, I think, against LSU. They did leave some points on the field, but generally speaking, I think, at the end of the first half against LSU was a tough one, right? Because the clock was mismanaged. That's a 2-minute offense situation that changes what you're going to do down in that area of the field. They still were not perfect, but of course they did score the touchdown late in that game. And then I thought that was probably the big glaring, I don't want to say weakness, but it was a big wart on an otherwise really impressive performance on Saturday against Utah State. But my takeaway from that, though, was that I'm not sure it's indicative of a real problem, because just watching that game and those sequences, it felt like they could run the ball into the end zone anytime they want to now. And At that point, Lincoln Riley was trying to spread the ball around, and it felt, based on his play calling, right, like he's trying to get Zachariah Branch a touchdown. Like he's trying to get Miller Moss a couple of touchdowns. Like Lincoln isn't blind to stats. We saw that a couple of years ago with Caleb Williams, right? Calling a double reverse quarterback receiver play for Caleb Williams against Notre Dame. Like he's aware of these things. And I think there was a pretty significant degree of basically Lincoln just playing with his food when it came down to the red zone. And it'll be a very different story when they play Michigan, right? Because that's going to be a front that, with 5 to 7 yards separating you from the goal line, that's going to be a tough group to run between the tackles. That's going to be a tough group to run in the A gap, because Mason Graham's a monster. I mean, those guys on their goal line set are a pretty imposing presence. But I'm not sure that I'm ready to panic about the red zone offense in a way that I think the results on the field might have suggested against Utah State, simply because I think Lincoln Riley made a deliberate choice to try and just spread the wealth and make sure everyone was having fun and make a culture decision almost in we're trying to integrate everyone and keep this, balanced attack. But I said this, I was texting with my college roommate who's a big USC guy, during the game. And our conclusion in the first quarter was, if they don't turn the ball over, SC could not throw and win this game exclusively running the ball, probably by 3 touchdowns, and I think that was true in the red zone. So I don't know. What do you make of the red zone offense? Because it's easy to look at the red zone numbers. It's easy to look at some of, the failed opportunities and the points left on the field and say, that's something they got to work on. But it kind of felt like they were sort of working on it in a game setting. It felt practicey as opposed to killer instinct.
Yeah, I think, Lincoln Riley will tell you he doesn't look at stats. So, make of that.
He's lying. He's lying.
Make of that. But I think you're right. There's certainly no need to panic about red zone execution. I think even more from a spreading the wealth perspective from Lincoln. Of course, Miller Moss is an extension of Lincoln Riley, but I do think Miller Moss too is very aware, and he's spoken about it. He told me in Indianapolis just that if there's one thing he wants this team to embody, it's and understand it's a little bit of the selflessness and understand how many weapons are on this team and to, not fight over touches and that sort of thing. And you saw, there's a couple plays where you looked like he almost forced it in a couple throws to, Deuce Robinson in the red zone and just it looked like, to your point, there might have been times where he was trying to kind of get guys a little bit more involved. If there's one area that within that I do think is a little bit, maybe just cause for concern or certainly evolution, is just that like this receiver room is very young and there is the potential for, I don't think Zachariah Branch is going to have too many drops. I don't know if this room in general is going to have too many drops, but there is the potential for those kinds of, underclassmen mistakes at times, those couple of drops and missed blocks or whatever it is, that, could hurt USC down the stretch against a tougher opponent. So, and those are kind of factors that, is not necessarily a game planning issue, but is just personnel. And so I do think that is one thing to keep an eye on, is just how this receiver room continues to develop, and guys like Branch and Jacoby Lane and Mekhi Lemon, how they kind of continue to progress. But overall, I'd agree with you. I don't think that's the red zone, I don't know, lack of effectiveness, whatever you want to call it. I mean, they still scored 48 points. I don't think it's
right.
I don't think it's a huge cause for concern. So yeah.
Yeah. And to your point about the young receivers, right? Like, you don't like to have mistakes that are lapses of concentration, but Yogi Roth made this point on the broadcast when I went back to give it a rewatch, and I thought it was a pretty astute point that, if you're USC's offense and Lincoln Riley, this game actually went about as perfectly as it could, because you did whatever you want. You scored 48 points, and you still have between 3 and 5 talking points of things that very visibly need to improve. So from a practice standpoint and from a keeping players engaged and keeping the narrative of development and improvement, honest and easily engaged with, those drops aren't the worst thing, right? Because that's not something that you're really going to drill all that much, but you're going to make the point that those are mistakes of attention and those are controllable mistakes. And so, I look at that and think that I sound like such a homer here by saying that, like, those mistakes are a good thing, but like, it's kind of dangerous when you have a game where it's almost flawless, especially when the next time you play is 2 weeks later against the reigning national champions. Like,
Yep.
You kind of need something to point at and go, we're not that good yet. Like, we won big. We had a lot of great things, but like, there's stuff here. And so as I look forward, like, we'll preview this more next week. We don't need to jump the gun too much, but we can talk Michigan here for just a second, because obviously Michigan, got boat raced by Texas in a game that was over probably in the second quarter. I think it was pretty obvious that Michigan just simply does not have the offense to win that kind of game. I thought Texas attacked them. Joel Klatt made a couple of really good points about this. The game plan for Texas essentially was, when Michigan had their 2 big D linemen on the field, attack the perimeters, get them fatigued with the snap count, and when they exit the game for a break, attack the middle running the ball. And they did a great job balancing those things. And it wasn't that they were running away from them so much as they were trying to fatigue them, then attack the soft spot when, those big bodies and those great players weren't there. I'm caught here, Luca, in a spot that I don't know what to do. I've said all offseason, without exception, the USC is going to lose to Michigan. I've been sure of it. I thought 2-1 was the dream start. I thought that when we broke it down, I gave a 5% chance that they start 3-0. But I also didn't expect Michigan to look anywhere near this bad. And I didn't expect USC's defense to look this far along this early. So here I am now confronted with the question of, am I drinking the Kool-Aid? Am I drinking the Kool-Aid and deciding that this is a game USC now needs to win? Because they don't, right? In terms of the playoff race and where they want to be at the end of the season, they absolutely can lose this game. But just as we said in the offseason, it's a great time to catch Michigan. You get them first 4 weeks of the season. They're going to play Arkansas State, so they'll get better in some areas, but they do not have a quarterback. They've yet to settle on a quarterback. Davis Warren probably is not the answer. Alex Orji cannot throw the ball, and Jack Tuttle's hurt, so who knows how that plays out. They have no receivers that spark fear from anybody, and a running game that, while Donovan Edwards is a dangerous home run hitter, is not the same guy that Blake Corum was, and is not going to give you the same kind of effort and power in 3 downs. I look at this game now, and I think this is a game that USC needs to win, because Penn State is going to get better. That'll be a tougher game later in the season. Wisconsin looked terrible this week, but they're going to get better, and that's going to be a tougher game later in September. Notre Dame was the worst of the week. I don't know if they're going to get better, but on paper, that's a tough game, right? And like, if 10-2 is your route into the playoff, and we want to see that, I think playoffs now a reasonable expectation from what we've seen in 2 games, provided the team stays healthy, because that obviously is a massive question mark, especially along the offensive line. Jonah Monheim, more than anyone, I think this offense goes as far as he can take them, because that is a position group that is wildly thin, and you need that guy in that spot. But am I overreacting here? And what do you think? Like, is this now, because it's now a winnable game. It's gone from a game that I'm certain USC is going to lose to a winnable game. Call it a coin toss. But is it reasonable now to make the case that, for the purposes of developing momentum both on the field and in the recruiting world, which we've already seen the tides begin to swing a little bit, Ty Jackson, the inside linebacker, making his big commitment, a lot of the rumblings around the Southern California players that USC kind of slow played. I'm fairly plugged into that world, and the rumblings there are very, very USC positive. From a momentum standpoint, does USC now need to beat Michigan in order to keep this train moving in the way that Lincoln Riley wants it to? Because they can lose technically and make the playoff, but I'm not sure that I trust them to lose this game and make the playoff.
Man, it's a tough question, because I was in the same camp. I thought they were absolutely going to lose this game, and then you come out and watch Texas do that to Michigan in the Big House, and I don't think it's an absolute must win for the purposes of continuing this huge wave of momentum that is built around the program. I don't think that, assuming it's not, if they lose and it's not embarrassing or whatever it is, I don't think that stops the momentum from a recruiting standpoint, from whatever it is. And actually, would probably kind of reset, this team, and maybe we're not as good as we thought we were this early or whatever it is. But I do think you kind of have to smell blood in the water here a little bit if you're USC and Lincoln Riley, and knowing that you have 2 weeks to prepare for this matchup. I think it's going to be a big test again, like I said, for the offensive line, for the run game, trying to do a lot of the same things that Texas did. And then, I think one thing, going back to your point earlier about having things to build on, or talking points to get better at, this defense is very noticeably not kind of resting on its laurels publicly. When they talk about, there was very little kind of public post-game, outcry over the shutout and this and that. And I think having guys like, Easton Mascarenas Arnold and veteran guys, Jamil Muhammad, who, when they say, hey, there's still a lot of stuff that we need to get better at from an execution standpoint, you believe it, and it's not just kind of a forced thing. And so I think that I do think that is a positive sign from that standpoint, heading into Michigan that this isn't a defense that's just gonna, like I said, rest on its laurels. But man, I do think I wouldn't call it a must-win game from a certain standpoint, but I think if you watch what Michigan did this past weekend and you see the momentum that USC's built up, and you end up losing that game to Michigan, I think you walk away with a lot of regret or a lot of, so I think that there has to be, and especially first game in the Big Ten for USC too, to just come in and knock out, the national champs. I just think that does a ton for the perception of this season and the program in the future. I think that's big.
I think you are 1,000% right. The one area that I disagree a little bit is that I think you might be able to label this a must win simply from a belief inside the building standpoint, right? Because belief is something that is hard to build and fragile to maintain. And you beat LSU week 1, and the belief now is through the roof. You do nothing against Utah State to undercut that belief. That's like, it's just this germinating little plant, right? Like you still have to be very careful with it. And to some extent, you'd rather not have to play Michigan in, week 4, your third game of the year, because you're trying to foster this belief that does need to last the season. But at the same time, you have an opportunity here to really kind of catalyze that growth and put this thing in an incubator that's going to, move the Bleav meter well down the road, which is huge, especially because you play, a Wisconsin team that on paper should be tough at the end of September. I mean, it gets easier to some extent, but it also doesn't. I don't know if I want to go all the way to say it's a must win, because I think that the narrative is going to continue to shift into a favorable space for USC. But I kind of think that from a Bleav standpoint and I think it goes both ways with the coaches and the players. I think the coaches need to see the team win this game so that they can Bleav the players are as locked in and focused, and they can Bleav that the cultural shift has the staying power that I think they hope. And I think the players need to win this game, because I think they need to feel that from themselves, that they are capable, that they just beat the national champs. And like, you worry about a letdown after that. But I think it's a game that we should be very, very excited about at the very least. Michigan's so interesting, though, because they do not in any way resemble Stanford post Jim Harbaugh, which I am fascinated by. And granted, Stanford did have Kevin Hogan immediately after Andrew Luck, and while he was by no means an all-everything quarterback, he operated that offense flawlessly. Michigan did not look anything like Michigan from a year ago. And perhaps it was something that we just didn't pay close enough attention to last year, because Michigan had such a soft early season schedule that I don't think most of the country really had an idea of what Michigan was until like week 8. So perhaps they were much the same and developed. I mean, clearly they had a better quarterback situation, which in, college, pro football, high school football, any level these days, makes all the difference in the world. And USC has the clear edge at that position, which is massive. But I think all of their goals are in front of them if they lose this game. I think all of the recruiting momentum will continue to grow even if they lose this game. But the one thing that I worry about them losing this game is how it affects the belief inside the building. I don't know. I don't spend any time inside, Heritage Hall and the McKay Center. Couldn't tell you what the resilience level on this group is. They showed some stuff against LSU for sure. But what happens when they actually fail? Because they're going to fail at some point. And this is an opportunity to, at the very least, kick that can down the curb, because this will feel like such a missed opportunity. Like that hurts a lot more than simply failing when you're beaten by a better team. Like you can lose to Penn State and kind of live with that, because that roster is talented and they're fairly well coached. And on any given day, a team like that can go anywhere and win. But Michigan, like you said, the blood in the water thing, they just look so vulnerable right now. And I do fear that losing that game is going to poke some serious holes in the team's belief inside their own building, that like, okay, look what Texas did to them, and we just lost to them. Like, maybe we're not where we want to be. Maybe we're not capable of being what we want to be, And so I'm going to sleep on this one for another 7 days. And when we get to game week, I'll make my call on whether it's a must-win game or not. But it's an interesting one at the very least. But we got a great week on the program. We were thankful to have Rhett Lewis on earlier in the week. Got Luca now, and we'll have some great programs next week. Luca, appreciate your time always. Enjoy the bye week and an opportunity to catch up on some other work. And your perspectives are always so useful and valuable on this program, so we appreciate it.
Thanks for the time, for having me, Cooper. Always appreciate being on.
All right, Luca, you take care, man. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.